It was a chilly night in Seattle, the kind that wraps around you like an old blanket you can't quite shake off. My husband, David, had just left for a business trip, leaving me alone in our new house for the first time. It's a charming, two-story place in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of house you dream about owning someday. But that night, it felt too big, too empty. I remember trying to settle into the quiet, convincing myself that the stillness was peaceful, not eerie. But, as the hours ticked by, that peace slowly morphed into something else, something that felt like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. As the night deepened, I found myself curled up on the couch, binge-watching a show to keep my mind occupied. You know how it is, trying to drown out the silence with noise. But then I heard it, a faint creaking sound from the floor above me. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling. After all, it was old, with its fair share of quirks. But as I sat there, straining to hear beyond the dialogue on the screen, the creaking continued, growing more pronounced with each passing minute. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. "It's just an old house, Emily," I muttered, shaking my head. But deep down, something didn't feel right. You know that gut feeling, when something just doesn't add up? Yeah, that. I decided to ignore it, turning the volume up on the TV and wrapping the blanket tighter around me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The creaking eventually stopped, but the unease lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. It wasn't until later, when I was brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed, that I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a creak, it was footsteps, clear as day, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, toothbrush still in hand. Who could it be? David wasn't due back for days, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to call someone, but curiosity, or maybe foolishness, got the better of me. I crept to the bottom of the stairs, peering up into the darkness. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving me standing there in a tense silence that felt like it could snap at any moment. I waited, holding my breath, half expecting something, or someone, to come barreling down the stairs. But nothing happened, just that thick, oppressive silence, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I finally forced myself to move, to climb those stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached the top, I found nothing. The hallway was empty, the doors all closed, everything exactly as it should be. But that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the whole situation that much creepier. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Was it my imagination? Maybe I was just jumpy, with David gone and the house so quiet. I told myself that's all it was, a trick of the mind. But as I turned to head back downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I tried to shrug it off, forcing myself to laugh at how paranoid I was being. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. And that night, as I lay in bed, sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise, every creak and groan of the house, sent my heart racing. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but even with the daylight streaming through the windows, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stayed in that house, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't understand, something that was just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't going to be pleasant. The next day started off like any other. I went about my usual routine, trying to push the events of the previous night to the back of my mind. But that lingering sense of unease just wouldn't go away. As I sat in the living room, sipping my morning coffee, something caught my eye, a dark, ominous stain on the ceiling. It was right above where I had been sitting the night before, directly beneath the upstairs hallway. At first, I thought it might be a leak, maybe from the old pipes in the house. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed off. The stain wasn't your typical water damage. It was darker, more like a smudge than a spot, and it seemed to spread ever so slightly as I watched. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid again. "It's probably nothing," I muttered, trying to focus on the work I had to do that day. But that stain kept drawing my attention, like a bad itch I couldn't scratch. Something about it felt wrong, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to creep into my thoughts. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stain was somehow connected to the footsteps I'd heard the night before. It's crazy, right? But that's how it felt, like the house was trying to tell me something it had been holding onto for years. By the time the sun started to set, I was on edge, jumping at every little noise. I knew I needed to get out of my head, so I decided to take a break and go for a walk. But when I got back, the stain was still there, darker and more menacing than before. Night fell, and with it came that same suffocating silence. I tried to distract myself, but the footsteps started again, louder this time, more deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, was pacing the hallway above me, back and forth, back and forth. My heart raced, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was going on. Grabbing a flashlight, I forced myself to head upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I reached the top, and that's when I saw it, messages, scrawled in dark red, covering the walls. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't just one message, but several, all written in what looked like blood. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. At first, the words seemed like gibberish, random letters and phrases thrown together in a chaotic mess. But as I got closer, the meaning began to take shape, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The messages were telling a story of violence, of death. And the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just some sick joke. This was real. This was something that had happened in this very house, decades ago. My hands trembled as I traced the words with my flashlight, trying to piece together the details. It was a story of a young woman, trapped, terrified, her life taken in the most brutal way imaginable. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was the woman whose footsteps I had been hearing, the woman whose blood now stained these walls. I couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. But there it was, right in front of me, undeniable and horrifying. I wanted to run, to get out of that house as fast as I could, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the gruesome tale unfolding before me. The final message was the worst of all, a chilling command that felt like it was directed right at me. Find me. It was scrawled in larger letters, almost as if it had been written in a desperate, last-ditch effort to be heard. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I could do anything. All I knew was that something terrible had happened in this house, and somehow, I was now a part of it. The room seemed to spin, and I felt like I might pass out, but I forced myself to keep standing, to keep reading, even as a sickening dread settled deep in my gut. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The days that followed were a blur, a descent into madness that I never saw coming. I couldn't get those messages out of my head. They haunted me, taunted me, refused to let me rest. I became obsessed, spending hours online, digging through old records, trying to uncover the truth about the house's past. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. The house had belonged to a young couple in the late 60s, the Thompsons. They seemed happy, perfect even, until one night, everything went horribly wrong. The wife, Margaret, was found dead, her body mutilated, her blood used to scrawl those same messages on the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. The husband, Richard, had vanished without a trace. Some said he'd gone mad, that the guilt of what he'd done drove him to disappear into the night, never to be seen again. Others believed he'd been taken, dragged away by some dark force that had claimed Margaret. As I read through the old newspaper clippings, I could feel the walls closing in on me, the air in the house growing thicker, more oppressive. It was like the very soul of the place had been poisoned by what had happened here, and now it was seeping into me, too. I started seeing things, visions, nightmares, I didn't know what to call them. They came at all hours, day and night, images of Margaret, her face twisted in fear, her eyes wide and pleading. She would appear in the corners of my vision, just for a second, but long enough to leave me shaken. Sometimes I'd hear her voice, soft, almost a whisper, begging me to help her. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was just exhausted, that all the stress was getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just in my head. Something was reaching out to me, trying to communicate, and it wasn't going to stop until I listened. As the days turned into nights, I found myself losing track of time. Hours would slip away without me noticing, and I'd come to, sitting at my desk with pages of notes in front of me, scribbles and drawings I didn't remember making. I barely ate, barely slept. My world had shrunk to the confines of this house, this story, this nightmare that had become my reality. I tried to reach out to friends, to family, but every time I picked up the phone, something would stop me, an icy fear, a whisper in my ear, something telling me that I was alone in this. That no one else could help me. The more I delved into the story of the Thompsons, the more I realized that Margaret wasn't just trying to communicate, she was trying to warn me. The visions became more intense, more vivid. I could feel her fear, her desperation, as if it were my own. And the footsteps, they never stopped. Every night, they would start again, that slow, deliberate pacing in the hallway above. I knew it wasn't Margaret walking those floors, though. It was something else, something darker, something that had been waiting in this house for decades. And now, it had its sights set on me. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred until I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that I was being watched. I'd find objects moved, things out of place, and I couldn't remember if I had done it or if something else had. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its walls closing in on me, suffocating me. I knew I needed to get out, to leave this place before it consumed me completely. But every time I tried, something held me back, a force, a presence, something that wasn't ready to let me go. By the time I decided to leave, it felt like the house was alive, breathing down my neck, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't stand another night of those footsteps, those relentless messages scrawled in blood on the walls. I knew that whatever had happened to Margaret Thompson was only the beginning. Something far more sinister had taken root in this place, and it was slowly tightening its grip around me. I packed my bags in a frenzy, throwing clothes and essentials into a suitcase without any real plan. I just needed to get out, to escape before it was too late. But as I hurried through the house, something strange happened. The footsteps began again, but this time, they weren't coming from the hallway above. They were right behind me, slow, deliberate, almost mocking in their persistence. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would burst out of my chest. I could feel the cold breath of someone, on the back of my neck. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt out the door and never look back. But my feet wouldn't move. It was like they were glued to the floor, held in place by a force stronger than fear itself. I turned, slowly, every muscle in my body tense, expecting the worst. And there she was, Margaret Thompson, or what was left of her. Her ghostly figure was standing there, bloodied and broken, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. But she wasn't the one to fear. No, she was pointing, her trembling hand directing my gaze to the wall behind her. I followed her gesture, and that's when I saw it, a new message, written in fresh, dripping blood. Asterisk, you are next. Asterisk, the words burned into my brain, searing themselves into my very soul. Everything inside me wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but stand there frozen in place. But I couldn't move, couldn't think. Margaret's apparition seemed to grow weaker, fading in and out like a flickering light, as if she was struggling to stay connected to this world. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving me alone with the chilling realization that this house wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, twisting into forms I couldn't, and didn't want to, identify. I grabbed my suitcase and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached for the doorknob, a cold, invisible hand closed around my wrist, stopping me in my tracks. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the house seemed to come alive around me, groaning and creaking like a living, breathing entity. I struggled against the grip, panic flooding my senses, but the harder I fought, the tighter it held. It was as if the house itself didn't want me to leave, like it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released me. I stumbled backward, gasping for
I never imagined life without Isabella could be this suffocating. You know, when you share decades with someone, the house kind of absorbs that person's essence, like a second skin over the walls. That's how it feels here now, like the house still carries her imprint, but at the same time, it's cold, distant, almost resentful of her absence. Every creak of the floor, every draft of wind through the old wooden windows, it used to be comforting, but now it just feels wrong. I've been trying to keep myself busy with mundane routines, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this hollow feeling will eventually dissipate. But it's been weeks, and instead of feeling better, it feels like the house is closing in on me. It's funny, or maybe it isn't, that I keep talking to Isabella. Not out loud, of course. That would be crazy, right? But in my mind, I'm constantly hearing her voice, like she's just stepped out of the room and is about to come back any moment. Yet, every time I turn a corner or glance at her favorite chair, reality slams me back. She's gone. And yet, sometimes it doesn't feel like she is. It started small, you know? Just little things. A picture frame slightly tilted, a book that wasn't where I left it. At first, I blamed myself. Grief does strange things, after all. You lose track of time, of space, of reality even. But the more I think about it, the less it feels like I'm the one losing my mind. Something's been happening here, in this house. I can't explain it, not fully, but I'm not so sure it's all in my head anymore. The other night, I was sitting in the living room trying to read, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. Just a flicker. I looked up, and I swear, one of Isabella's old porcelain figurines, those little angels she loved, had moved. Not fallen, mind you, just moved. It was subtle, like someone had gently nudged it a few inches. I stood there for a good minute, just staring, waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's grief. Giovanni's finally cracked. And maybe I have, but you've gotta understand, this house is old. It creaks and groans like an arthritic man, and that's normal. What's not normal is the way I keep feeling like someone's watching me. I can't shake it. I'll be sitting in the kitchen, the back of my neck prickling like there's a pair of eyes just behind me. I turn around, of course, but there's never anyone there. It's just that same empty house. But the feeling doesn't go away. It's there, constantly gnawing at me. Like the house itself is alive. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I even joked about it with a neighbor. Maybe Isabella's still keeping an eye on me, I said. We both laughed, but deep down, it didn't feel like a joke. The thing is, it doesn't feel like Isabella. If it were her, I'd feel warmth, comfort, maybe a little sadness, but not this coldness. No, this is something else. It's darker, heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. At night, it's worse. I hear things, whispers, I think. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps in the hallway, other times just a faint murmur, like someone's talking in another room. But the rooms are all empty. I've started avoiding certain parts of the house, which sounds ridiculous, even to me. It's my home, but there's something off about the upstairs bedroom, the one Isabella and I shared. The air feels thicker up there, like it's harder to breathe. I've stopped sleeping in it altogether. Now I stick to the couch downstairs. It's less suffocating there. Still, even then, the sensation of being watched never leaves. It clings to me, almost like a shadow. And no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that something's about to happen, something I won't be able to explain away so easily. And that's the thing, isn't it? When you've spent your whole life in the realm of science, like I have, you tend to dismiss anything that doesn't fit into a neat little box of logic and reason. But I can't deny it any longer. Something is wrong in this house. It's not just my grief, and it's not just the loneliness. It's something deeper. I can feel it lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The question is, what happens when it does? You know, the mind is a tricky thing. It's like a maze sometimes, filled with corners you can't see around until you're right on top of them. That's how it's been for me these past few days. I thought maybe the unease was just in my head, an old man's imagination running wild in a house that's seen better days. But then, things started happening that I just couldn't explain away. It's not just the whispers or the cold spots anymore. It's more than that. I've been noticing things that shouldn't move, moving. Take the picture frames, for instance. There's this one of Isabella and me on our wedding day, hanging in the hallway. I've walked past it 1,000 times, but the other day, it was tilted, just slightly. I straightened it out, didn't think much of it. But the next morning, it was crooked again. This time, the angle was different, like someone had twisted it deliberately. It's not just the frame, either. The kitchen chairs, they're never where I left them. I'll push one in, come back later, and it's been pulled out, like someone was about to sit down but never did. It's unsettling, to say the least. Now, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, not exactly. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe there's more to this world than what we can see. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, old wood shifting around. But it's happening too often, and it's too specific. Like that time I found the back door unlocked. I know I locked it. I'm meticulous about that. Yet, there it was, wide open one morning, swinging gently as if someone had just walked through it. I checked the house from top to bottom, but nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place, except for the door. The strangest part is that every time I try to brush it off, something else happens, something that makes it impossible to ignore. The other night, I heard footsteps upstairs. It was late, well past midnight, and I was lying on the couch, trying to read. At first, I thought it was just the house creaking again, but then the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was the distinct sound of someone walking, one foot after the other, right above me. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to get up, to go check, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, listening, frozen in place. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. I finally mustered the courage to get up and go upstairs, but when I reached the top, everything was still. The doors were all closed, the rooms exactly as I'd left them. But that didn't ease the tension. If anything, it made it worse. I could feel that presence again, stronger this time, like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I didn't dare turn around. I just backed out of the room and went downstairs as quickly as I could. I've started leaving the lights on at night, something I never used to do. It's silly, really. What difference do a few lights make against something you can't even see? But it gives me a small comfort, a tiny illusion of control in a situation that's spiraling out of it. The thing is, the more I try to regain that control, the more I realize how futile it is. Whatever's in this house, it's not something I can reason with or explain away. It's there, lurking in the shadows, moving things, watching me. And it's only getting bolder, more daring, like it's waiting for something I'm not sure I want to find out. The basement. It was never a place I spent much time in. Dark, damp, filled with all the forgotten remnants of a life that once was. It always felt like a world apart from the rest of the house. But after all the strange happenings, I found myself drawn there. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe desperation, but I had to know if there was something, anything, that could explain what I was experiencing. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and descended those creaky wooden stairs. The air grew colder with each step, thick with a musty scent that clung to everything. Down there, it was as if the house had stored all its secrets. The walls, lined with old bricks, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a slow, rhythmic beat that I could almost feel in my chest. I swept the flashlight across the room, illuminating old furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs in every corner. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual signs of neglect. But then, the light caught something odd, a crack in the far wall, just wide enough to be noticeable, as if the house itself had split open to reveal a hidden wound. I approached cautiously, every step echoing in the stillness. The crack ran vertically, jagged and unnatural, and the closer I got, the more it felt like something was calling to me from beyond it. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and touched the wall. The bricks felt colder than the rest of the basement, and as I pressed against them, I felt them give way slightly, as if they were loose. Without thinking, I began to pull at them, one by one, until there was a hole large enough to peer through. What I saw on the other side sent a chill down my spine. There, beyond the wall, was a passage, a narrowed tunnel leading downward into darkness. The air that wafted out was foul, a mix of rot and decay that made me gag. I hesitated, but something compelled me to go further, to see what lay at the end of that tunnel. I grabbed an old lantern from a nearby shelf, lit it, and squeezed through the opening. The tunnel walls were rough, carved from ancient stone, and as I descended, the temperature dropped even further. It felt like I was walking into the very bowels of the earth, each step taking me deeper into a place that time had forgotten. The tunnel eventually opened up into a cavernous space, and as the light from my lantern flickered across the walls, I realized with horror where I was. Catacombs. The walls were lined with skeletal remains, bones stacked neatly in rows, skulls staring back at me with hollow eyes. This was no ordinary basement, it was a burial ground, ancient and untouched. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My house, the place where I had lived for decades, was built on top of this. A final resting place for souls that had never known peace. But it wasn't just the sight of the bones that terrified me. It was the feeling, that same oppressive presence I had felt upstairs, only now it was stronger, more tangible. The air was thick with it, a malevolent force that seemed to wrap itself around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I could hear whispers, not just in my mind this time, but echoing off the stone walls, voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then, I saw them, figures moving in the shadows, spectral shapes that flickered in and out of existence, watching me with eyes that gleamed like cold steel. I didn't stay to see more. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow tunnel, the sound of the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if they were chasing me. I burst back into the basement, slammed the bricks back into place, and stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, as the silence of the house enveloped me once more. But it wasn't the comforting silence of before. No, this silence was filled with the knowledge of what lay beneath, a hidden world of the dead, restless and angry, disturbed by my presence. And I knew, deep down, that they weren't done with me yet. Since that night in the basement, nothing has been the same. It's as if...
So, let me tell you about that night. It started like any other, you know? Just me, Aiko Tanaka, a 22-year-old university student, trying to catch up on my studies in this small, old apartment right in the middle of Tokyo. My roommate was out for the weekend, so I had the place to myself, which I thought would be perfect. I mean, what could go wrong? The city was unusually quiet, and the usual hustle and bustle felt so distant. I could hear the faint hum of the streetlights outside, casting this dim, almost eerie glow through the curtains. It was just enough to make the shadows in the corners of the room seem a little too dark, a little too still. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you, but you're alone? Yeah, that's how I felt. It's not like I'm one to get spooked easily, but something about that night was different. The apartment was too quiet. Every creak, every groan of the old wooden floors seemed amplified, like the place was alive. I remember brushing it off, telling myself I was just being silly. I mean, I've lived here for a while now, and it's an old building, old buildings make noises, right? But as I got ready for bed, I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, almost like someone had left a window open, but everything was shut tight. Then, as I glanced over at the mirror in my room, I saw it fogging up, like someone had just breathed on it. I shook my head, convinced it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. A long day of classes and too much coffee could do that to you, right? But still, there was this nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. The mirror was clear just a moment ago, and now, there it was, fogged up for no apparent reason. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the unease didn't go away. It was like there was something in the room with me, something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. And that cold, it wasn't just in the air, it was creeping into my bones. As I finally climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind kept wandering back to that mirror, and the way it had fogged up out of nowhere. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. After all, I was a grown woman, a university student, for crying out loud. Ghosts and haunted mirrors were things of childhood nightmares, not something that happened in real life. But despite my best efforts to ignore it, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. It was like the darkness in the room was pressing in on me, and no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in the blankets, I couldn't get warm. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't help but think back to stories I'd heard growing up, stories of spirits and vengeful ghosts. They were just old wives' tales, right? But the way that coldness seemed to cling to me, the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking, made me start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to those tales. I kept trying to push those thoughts away, to focus on something else, anything else, but it was no use. My mind kept drifting back to the mirror and the way it seemed to have a life of its own. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, though I can't say I felt very rested. My dreams were filled with strange images, distorted faces, whispers that I couldn't quite understand, and that same coldness wrapping itself around me like a shroud. When I finally woke up, it was still dark outside, and the room was even colder than before. I remember sitting up, rubbing my eyes, and looking around, half expecting to see something out of place. But everything looked normal, at least at first glance. It wasn't until I looked at the mirror again that I realized just how wrong I was. The fog was back, but this time, it wasn't just a random patch of condensation. There, in the middle of the mirror, was a handprint, small, delicate, and definitely not mine. My heart started pounding in my chest as I stared at it, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who could have left that? How could it even be there? I hadn't touched the mirror at all. But deep down, I knew. I knew there was no one else in the apartment, and yet, someone, or something, had made that mark. And that's when I realized that this was only the beginning. The night felt like it had no end. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but it wasn't peaceful, more like drifting into a restless, uneasy slumber. I woke up with a jolt, the kind of wake-up that leaves your heart racing and your mind trying to catch up. Everything was quiet, too quiet, and the room was still so damn cold. It wasn't like the usual coolness of a Tokyo night. This was different, like the air itself was heavy with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I lay there, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the mirror across the room, was a shadow faint at first, just a vague shape that could easily be mistaken for a trick of the light. But the more I stared, the more it came into focus, and my stomach twisted into knots. It was the silhouette of a girl, standing right behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head, praying that I wouldn't see anything. But of course, there was nothing there, just the empty room, as it had always been. I should have felt relieved, but instead, my fear only grew. Because when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, and now, it was clearer. I knew that face. I would recognize it anywhere. It was Yumi, the girl from my high school, the one who had died under such mysterious circumstances. The one I hadn't thought about in years. But there she was, staring back at me from the mirror with eyes full of something dark and terrible. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. Memories I'd buried deep began to surface, memories of how I'd treated her, how I'd joined in when others had teased and tormented her. I'd been cruel, and now it seemed like Yumi had come back to remind me of that, to make me pay for what I'd done. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. It was like my throat had closed up, refusing to let out the terror that was building inside me. I could only watch, frozen in place, as Yumi's ghostly hand reached out from the mirror, her fingers brushing against the glass as if trying to break through. Her eyes were locked on mine, and they were filled with so much pain, so much anger, that it took everything in me not to look away. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from hers. It was as if she had me in some kind of trance, and I was powerless to do anything but stare back at her. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter as Yumi's reflection grew clearer, more solid. It was like she was pulling herself out of the mirror, inch by inch, and all I could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear. The temperature in the room dropped even more, and I could see my breath fogging up in the air, just like the mirror had before. My skin prickled with cold, and the sense of dread that had been gnawing at me all night exploded into full-blown terror. This wasn't just a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real, and I had no idea how to make it stop. Finally, something in me snapped. I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the mirror as fast as I could, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. But no matter how far I moved, I couldn't escape her gaze. Yumi's eyes followed me, unblinking, filled with a rage that I could feel deep in my bones. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that mirror as possible, but something kept me rooted in place, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that it wouldn't matter. No matter where I went, Yumi would find me. She wasn't just in the mirror, she was everywhere, in the walls, in the shadows, in the very air I was breathing. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went quiet. The mirror fogged up again, obscuring her face, and the cold seemed to lift, just a little. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had just happened was some kind of twisted hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. Yumi wasn't gone. She was just waiting, biding her time, and I was helpless to stop her. The next few hours were a blur, but they felt like an eternity. I crawled back into bed, desperate for the safety that the covers used to bring me, but it was no use. Every sound, every creak in the apartment seemed magnified, each one a reminder that I wasn't alone. The darkness felt alive, pulsing with a cold energy that seeped into my skin and settled deep into my bones. I couldn't stop thinking about Yumi, about the way her eyes had pierced through me, filled with all the pain I'd caused her. The regret and guilt that I'd buried so long ago were now clawing their way back to the surface, and there was no escaping them. I pulled the blanket over my head, hoping that if I couldn't see the room, I could convince myself that everything was fine. But the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmuring that I could almost ignore. But they grew louder, and soon I could make out my name being called over and over again. Aiko. Aiko. The voice was soft but insistent, like a distant echo carried on the wind, yet somehow it was right there, next to me, all around me. I knew it was her. It had to be. No one else could have made my blood run so cold with just a whisper. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out, but that only made it worse. With my sight taken away, the other senses heightened, and the darkness behind my eyelids seemed to press down on me, suffocating me with its weight. The whispers turned into sobs, quiet and heart-wrenching, and they were coming from everywhere at once. I wanted to cry out, to beg for it to stop, but my voice was still trapped in my throat. My own breath was ragged, the sound of it only adding to the chaos in my head. The sobbing continued, and it was then that I realized Yumi wasn't just haunting me, she was in pain, and I was the cause of it. Objects in the room started to move, slowly at first, a book fell off the shelf, a picture frame tilted, and then, one by one, they began to crash to the floor. The noise was deafening in the silence of the night, each sound making me jump, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel the air growing colder with each passing minute, the kind of cold that burned as it touched my skin. I was shaking, but whether it was from fear or the cold, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. All I knew was that Yumi's spirit wasn't satisfied with just scaring me. She wanted me to feel everything she had felt, the fear, the loneliness, the despair. As the night dragged on, I could feel myself starting to lose grip on reality. The lines between the world I knew and the nightmare that was unfolding around me were blurring. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had done, how I had treated Yumi like she was nothing, how I had laughed with the others while she suffered. Now, that laughter was echoing in my head, mocking me, taunting me with my own cruelty. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, this was my punishment, and there was no way out. Yumi wasn't going to stop until I'd paid for everything I'd done to her. Then, I felt it, a force, cold and powerful,